G'day guys, you're back with MiracleMAX. Today in the workshop we have a Ford Focus 2010 model with a 2-litre Duratec engine in it. What's the problem? Well, it's got the money light stuck on the dash. Let's check it out. The other day the customer came in and they didn't have much time, so I just chucked on the scan tool to see what that fault code was. It's a P2008, which relates to the intake manifold runner. So I know these Ford Focuses have quite a large issue with the intake runner, the swirl flaps vibrating and carrying on. Eventually they wear out, they create all sorts of issues. But on this particular vehicle I'd like to do a few checks before I make that judgment call. Now the other day I did clear those fault codes because I wanted to see if they came back, and there's no check engine light on at the moment and there is no fault codes involved. Let's have a look at the intake manifold system and see what causes this issue. So what is an intake runner and what are they designed for? Well, on the actual Ford Focus they have this plastic inlet manifold. Great idea, I'm sure. Cut down on costs as well as weight, as manufacturers always trying to save money. So using my black pointy thing, these things here are called swirl flaps. They're designed to pivot inside the intake manifold, and at idle they are pretty much closed or very, very close to closed, allowing just a small amount of airflow to go through. This increases turbulence within the intake manifold system, and what this does is cut back on the emissions, and it helps out with fuel economy as well. Now this is only at idle when they're closed over, but as the revs increase these flaps open up like this to allow more airflow to go through. However, in the starting condition they will be open to allow more airflow to allow the engine to start. On this particular Ford Focus you can buy the swirl flap arrangement here, but I don't believe that you can buy the actual stainless steel rod that goes through. It's a square section rod, and that's why a lot of people have issues with the rod, and sometimes they turn them around the other way so they're in different wear areas. But the swirl flaps are available. But in this particular case I don't think that the swirl flaps are faulty, but because the check engine light hasn't come back on immediately, this customer came back about a week later and the check engine light is off and there are no fault codes. But let's have a look under the bonnet to see if we can isolate what perhaps the fault might be. So before we get all excited and do heaps and heaps of testing, we should just look at the basics. Now this actuator down here, there he is down there, see that little fella there? That's the arm that actuates it, and it goes back to a diaphragm in behind the inlet manifold. Now we need to see if that thing is working, because that will tell us several things. First of all, that the vacuum hoses are okay on the actuator. Secondly, that there's a vacuum supply to the actuator, and also that the ECU is operating the solenoid to bring the actuator off and on. I'm hoping that I can just turn the ignition on and maybe that might go through a little self-test procedure. Let's have a look. Don't worry about all the dodgy noise, that's just the electronic throttle body going through its paces, doing some self-test procedures. But as you saw, the little lever is actually pulled in, hasn't it? So we know that we've got vacuum, stored vacuum, so the hoses should be okay, and this is pulling on that big long lever that we looked at on that photo before. So I'm not overly concerned about the intake runner system as such, but what would cause the light to come on? And there she goes, she's come back home. So I know all that system is okay, ECU, vacuum hoses, actuator, the lever itself isn't mechanically jammed at this point in time. So what else can we check? A lot of these later model vehicles, particularly those with plastic inlet manifolds, have a problem with wetting. In other words, the oil and the fuel that come through there combine to create a carbon build-up within the intake manifold system. Reason being is because it's not getting correct mixing of the air and fuel, because the injectors are either direct injection, which goes straight into the cylinder itself, or very, very close indirect injection, which is just straight onto the inlet manifold and very, very close to the cylinder. So we don't get a lot of mixing when the air and fuel coming into the cylinder itself or into the inlet manifold, and as a result we get a huge amount of carbon build up within the inlet manifold. So can we have a look inside the inlet manifold? Well, through the magic of TV and a cheap inspection camera from Audi, we should be able to have a look to a certain extent. Just keep in mind, guys, that you want the ignition turned off and also the key out, and let it sit for a few minutes, because these fellas will go through a self-test procedure. In other words, this throttle butterfly will move up and down at a certain rate, so don't get your pinky stuck in there, guys. It will hurt like hell. So what I've done is turned off the ignition, pulled out the key, let it sit for a little while, and I haven't seen any more activity at my throttle flap there. So what I'll do, just to protect it, is stick in a bit of hose, and that's just to hold it open, and so it's not going to create any damage against the wall or anything like that. Now what we'll do is have a look with our inspection camera. I had a good look there before and I could see quite a bit, but of course it always looks different on camera. It's like going to the movies. All I need is popcorn and a Coke and I'm set. Alright, so we're going down and down and down, but you can see, have a look at the walls themselves. Can you see that? Might be a bit hard for you guys to see it. You can see it's quite wet. The further we go in, the worse it gets. It's just a little hard to focus in there. Give it a bit more light maybe. You can see against the wall there, it's actually quite wet. Not as bad as I've seen, and there's not as much carbon build-up as I have seen in other vehicles, but certainly it's got a few issues. Let's put another LED. That's coming up to the swirl flaps there, I think. But when I had a look before, they were actually quite wet. You see the moisture on there, and that'll just build up into carbon. Not sure if you guys can see that much at all, sorry. But there, how's that looking? Alright, so you can see it's quite wet. Now, it's not like we can give it a quick scrub, but I might add some intake cleaner. Some people like it, some people don't like it, some people disagree with it, but I'm going to give it a try. I have used it before, the Subaru style. It's actually quite good, and I believe for this particular case that it will be a good option. It's not overly bad. If it was really bad, I'd pull the intake manifold off and clean it, but in this case we'll give it a try and see what happens. So obviously I'm not sponsored by Subaru or anything like that, but this is actually quite a good product. The dealers use it each service to keep the upper cylinder clean, to stop this wetting or this carbon build up in the intake system, and the apprentices reckon that it's great stuff, and from what I've used so far it works quite well. She is empty, mate. She's all gone. Done. You don't mess with this stuff, it's quite acidic, and what I ended up doing was pulling off the intake and just opening my throttle plate and squirting in half the can as per the instructions, and then you let it sit for 5 minutes, and then as you saw I squirted the rest in through this vacuum hose which comes off, I think it's a brake boost or something like that. I'll pop that back on shortly. Let it sit for another 5 minutes, give it a decent rev, get rid of all any muck that's inside, and then take it for a good long road test. We might have a look inside afterwards and see what it's like. Has it improved it? So I'm back from a road test. It ran a bit rough for a while, but that's understandable. Gave it a good thrashing. Gave it a really decent road test, we'll call it that, and came back here and the engine is nice and smooth. So as I said before, does this cleaner work at all? And is it something that you would want to use on a regular basis? When might you use it and when might you not use it? Okay, as you can see, I've got my hose jammed back into the throttle body just to hold that plate open again. I've got a torch shoved in there too, plus my inspection camera. So let's have a look at the inspection camera and see what we can see inside. Okay, you'll have to bear with me of course, see what we can see, but just having a quick look around, it looks a lot cleaner than it did before. It's a little bit hard. That's because I've covered half my LEDs with oil. So if we go in there, you can see it's a lot cleaner. There's none of that black carbon that's sitting there that was there before. I'm not saying this is the ultimate answer, but it's not bad, hey. It looks pretty good. I can't see any major issues there. And I'm sure that the swirl flaps are cleaner as well. And this is almost to the other side of the inlet manifold. Bit hard to see. But yeah, hey, that's heaps better than it was before. No doubt in my mind at all. Nice. cool. Even looking at the back of the throttle plate there, you can see that it's a lot drier than it was before. It's not full of carbon. It's a little bit dirty, but it's certainly not full of carbon like it was before. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with those results. They're good. I've just done a full system search and you can see I'm happy with the results. Zippo, no fault codes. Excellent news. Look guys, I'm not going to claim this as a total victory, but for now I believe that the issue is solved-ish. These Ford Focuses really suffer from the intake runner system playing up, those swirl flaps jamming, wearing out, and generally just falling apart. They literally fall apart inside the engine. So it's not something that you want to mess with. You want to make sure that you keep a good eye on it. I believe in this particular case that perhaps there was some carbon build-up that was jamming the intake runner flaps at some particular point, enough for the ECU to log a fault code. Using that upper engine cleaner, I believe, has helped in this particular case, but it's not the sort of thing you would want to do on a heavy carboned intake manifold or an engine with a lot of kilometres on it. This thing has only got 80,000 Ks on it. So I was happy to do that, and checking it afterwards, I could clearly see the results were good. Okay, so not all things go according to plan. The Ford Focus is back in the workshop yet again. The fault is intermittent. As I mentioned already, these Ford Focuses have a real problem with the intake manifold runner system. Since last time I've done some extra research, and of course Tat, the automotive technician, has come to the rescue once again. I've come across several articles on the site dealing on this particular fault code, and that's going to put me in a good diagnostic direction that hopefully we can find the fault. So let's have a brief look at some of these articles. Here's one of the articles that I mentioned before, and this is very typical of the fault that happens with these Ford Focuses. That's what's happened to this particular vehicle. So as you can see, it had very slight performance issues, and sometimes that can be a limp home mode, just a section of a limp home mode. They're generally into about 4 or 5 categories. And as you can see down here, it's a P2008, the manifold intake runner. Now over here, they ended up replacing the intake manifold runner solenoid set. Now I'll get to that shortly. So that's that particular article. This one over here is a little more detailed, and this is probably more typical of what I'm experiencing with this particular vehicle. So the check engine light came on a few times but wouldn't come on at the time of testing. That's what I've had. So the fault code is in the background, but it isn't bringing on the check engine light at the moment. And this is more the fault code that I'm experiencing, even though it's the same number. It's giving us some more details here. It says intake runner control circuit, open bank 1. So we flip him over. Yes, as you can see, I've been researching as usual. They've pretty much followed exactly what I did as well. So they cleared the codes to start with, and the check engine light came back on 8 days later. And also they've done the same thing here, checked for vacuum leaks, etc., which is what I did. Back to the other repair solution, this is what I did. Had prior inspection where intake was cleaned. So that's what I did. That's the method that I used. So if we go back over to this one here, the vacuum supply was checked as I did, and I'm just about to check these solenoids. I believe that that may be the issue. I did check all the vacuum hoses, they were fine. This article was brilliant. It had some really good information in it, and it gives you the testing procedure as well as some of the resistance readings of the coils on the solenoids. So hopefully it should make it a lot easier to find, and then we can organise the parts, etc. So Tat, the automotive technician, has once again come to the rescue. If you're not subscribed to them, guys, I strongly suggest you do. There's a wealth of information and it can make your day a lot easier, that's for sure. So as you can see, the guy took some brilliant photos to show us locations and more information of how to test it. So that's what we're going to do next. So at the moment the check engine light is off. Does that mean that there's no fault? Well, we need to hook up the scan tool, don't we? So I've hooked up the G-scan. Let's have a look at what we've found. You can see it's a P2008 once again, and if you have a look on the right hand side you can see it's still present. Now the solenoids in question are tucked away in between the battery area over here and the engine cover. So we'll need to remove our engine cover, chuck it out the road. So the solenoids in question are these guys here. So if we zoom in we can see the area that we're in at the moment. Here's our throttle body, here's our air filter, a battery, and it's around this area just behind the last coil, ignition coil. It's just around that area. So let's have a closer look at that. Here's number 4 coil. So you can see these 2 solenoids are the solenoids in question. I did check these hoses the other day, the vacuum hoses, but hey, it's not a bad idea to double check your work. Keep in mind that these vacuum hoses, they pick up vacuum and then one goes off to the actuator that we looked at last time. So what sort of testing can we do? Well, we can do several things. We need to make sure that it is being controlled by the ECU, which I don't think it has an issue, but we'll check that anyway. And of course we need to do a resistance check on both of these solenoids. So we can do that by removing these connectors and then doing a resistance check with our multimeter. As I've mentioned heaps of times, we need to do what's called terminal retention. So if we pop off one of these connectors, come on there little fella, and we can use a terminal or a male fitting that's the same as what's inside the solenoid there, and just gently push it inside the female connector to make sure that it's got a good connection, or it's nice and tight as it goes in and out. Alright, so that's good with that one. I'm happy with that. So now I'll check for resistance on these 2 terminals. So I've just got some random wires that have been taken out of other connectors at different points. Alright, so you can see here we've got 35.5 ohms. That's a reasonable amount of ohmage. Keep in mind, if we heat that up, it may get worse. We'll do the resistance check of the other one shortly, and then I might heat them up and freeze them just to see what sort of variation that makes. If there's a break in the coil when we heat it up, it may go to out of limits. Let's have a look at our other one. So just on our second solenoid, I'm going to do a terminal retention check, and that's sliding in and out okay, no problemos. Let's hook up to this solenoid and see what the resistance tells us on this one. That's interesting, this one's showing us 35.4, so they're very, very similar. I just had a quick look at the tap magazine and that said 66 ohms, so 35 is certainly okay. I might just heat them up now and see if that varies them, or freeze them as well perhaps, and have a quick look at that and see if that makes a difference. I've got my heat gun, I'll just heat up the solenoids and see if that makes a difference. And of course, as we heat things up, resistance will increase naturally, but I'm looking for something that's going to go way out of range. Whoa, what happened there? Look at that. Did you see that? That went hugely out of range, didn't it? We'll just let that cool down for half a shake of a lamb's tail and see if that's going to make a difference. But that, wow, did that stand out or did that stand out? 300 kilo ohms with a bit of heat attached to it. How hot is it? Yeah, pretty hot. Going to get 3rd degree burns on that thumb, but never mind. We'll just let it cool down a little bit. Then we'll try the next solenoid. That could be the faulty fella, because as this customer takes this away and goes for a bit of a drive, of course the heat under the engine bay increases, changing the resistance of the solenoid. And of course it may get to this stage where it goes out of parameters and the ECU will then say, hey, time to put on a fault code. So this might be our fault, fingers crossed. We'll have a look at the other solenoid and see if that does the same or not. So we've got 36.5, I'll heat this one up now and see what it does. Well, that certainly seems a little more stable than the other one, doesn't it? It's not shooting up to the 300 and it's not increasing at all. Damn it, it just increased. Went to outer limits, look at that. That's not even registering at all. Wow. That's very interesting. That just open circuited, didn't it? I might put some freeze spray on it just to speed up the process, hopefully, without cracking them, of course. And hopefully that one should come back into range once again. But wow, that's pretty impressive, isn't it? It's going from being right within limits to outer limits in a matter of seconds. There we go. See, it's starting to come back into range now. 50, 40, whatever. But it didn't take much to throw that one out of range, that's for sure. So one of these solenoids activates this little lever down here. You can see it's green, and I've got my mini vac in there, and I'll just apply a bit of vacuum to it. I'll just show you I'm applying vacuum to it to start with, and that should pull that lever on. And of course we shouldn't see any bleed back in the vacuum at all, which we're not. So that indicates that the hose as well as the actuator is in good condition. I'll just show you what it looks like with my big fat mini vac out the road. So see that green lever there? Let's just pull a vacuum on that, see it moving, and of course that should hold in place. It shouldn't return until I release the vacuum. So I'm still holding the vacuum, and as we saw, the vacuum held. Just release the vacuum now and the lever comes back into place. So that tells me that the hose is okay, the one that goes to the actuator, and of course the actuator itself. On to the next one. Here's the second actuator that I'm checking now, and that's the fella downstairs, just about with the pointy finger there, right there. So we'll put some vacuum, we'll apply some vacuum to that and see what it does, and if of course it does hold. That's the important thing. So make sure that the vacuum holds, it doesn't bleed off at all, which is looking pretty good. And just proof of concept, I'll show you the actuator being moved. So have a look down there, you'll see that brown fella. That's moving away, isn't it, of course? And if I release the vacuum, it should pop up again. Okay, so once again, this side of the solenoid is okay. The vacuum hose is okay, and of course that actuator is holding vacuum. It looks like it is the solenoids. They're certainly very heat affected. They cut in and out very quickly with regard to resistance. So that would account for it, and they are in fact a common fault. So I'll speak to the customer about purchasing another set of solenoids. You buy them as a pair on that particular plate that they're attached to. It's now 2 weeks later and the check engine light has just come back on. What's the fault code? Is it any different? No, it's still the elusive P2008, which is the open circuit in the intake manifold runner control circuit. I feel pretty sure that these solenoids should fix the problem, but I'm going to test the old ones in comparison to the new ones. I've just pulled off the solenoid pack here, as you can see, but have a look underneath. Check it out. It's got this massive heat sink or heat accumulation area, you know, and that's quite hot on the pinkies there, guys. So think of that. All that heat is being stored in this area here, going through to these solenoids, and of course the solenoids in turn, once they get hot, they're going to break down, and that's the problem with this particular fella, I believe. It's all that accumulated heat from this area, heating up these solenoids and eventually breaking down the wiring so that it gains an open circuit eventually, and that's what our fault code is. Let's bench test them and see what they do. How I've got it set up is this is my new solenoid pack, and this is the resistance being measured on that solenoid, this one that I believe is faulty on this one over here. This is my old solenoid pack. This is the one that we'll be comparing, and this is the multimeter reading, or the ohm reading of that back solenoid, which I feel may be faulty. As you can see, at ambient temperature, they're fairly close, aren't they? So let's give them a bit of grief. Let's heat them up with the hot air gun and see how they compare. I'm trying to do it as even as possible to give a good reading between the two. Already, look at that, hey? Isn't that clear? So this is the mega ohm range already. This has made no difference whatsoever, pretty much, has it? We can clearly see that this back one is super faulty. Sooner or later, that's going to go to, oh, there she goes, open circuit, and there is our fault code, the P2008, which indicated that it was an open circuit in the control circuit, which it is. Clear evidence there, guys, which is awesome, because now I can fit this solenoid pack with confidence and know that I should have the fault fixed. You can never be 100% sure until you come up with a tested outcome and time has passed, but hey, look, there's the evidence. This bloke here has gone up like, hey, 1 ohm, no big deal. This bloke over here, he's out of his mind, he's not happy. Good news, we pop this new bloke in and everything should be honky-dory. Before you go on your final road test, make sure you clear out that fault code. What's it say? No DTCs. Got to love that. Okay, put it back together, Max, and go for a road test. And of course that pesky check engine light is now out. So, yep, all good for a road test. I've just been on a 13-kilometre road test and the check engine light has remained out. I've done another scan, no fault codes anywhere, so good news. I must admit this has taken a little bit longer to try and figure out, simply because I couldn't recreate the conditions of the fault when it happened. Owner is an older person. She doesn't drive the vehicle much and certainly doesn't go on long distances. Therefore, that's why I took it for a bit of a hammering. took it for a bit of a road test to try and get it up to temperature, not just the engine temperature, but the engine bay temperature, which would create that heat sink, which would create the solenoid to open, therefore bring on the check engine light, blah, 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 including the fault code. Just keep in mind that the check engine light would come on and then go off, come on and go off. The reason being is because the check engine light has to come on for an emissions fault, and that's what this one would be. But the problem is, as soon as it cooled down, the wires would reconnect and give us normal resistance, therefore the check engine light would go out. Anyway, the use of a heat gun was a great aid in trying to find the fault, reproduce the conditions of the fault, and that's when we saw it go out of range. So double thumbs up on that one. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Feel free to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to comment down below. Hey, don't forget about that notification bell. You don't want to miss any future videos. So until next time, this is MiracleMAX signing off. I'll catch you later.